Hey guys, welcome to. Okay, so I actually need to wait. I'm gonna make sure that we're live when we actually are live. All right,
Okay.
so I'm testing out this new software, so I'm getting used to it. No big deal. All right, so this is what we're doing tonight in the after show. Is we're talking about more evidence for the Kalam, and I'm just gonna pass it basically right over to you, Rob. What other contempt? Because you mentioned right at the end of the previous section here that
Yeah.
there's a lot of like new contemporary arguments being talked about right now in the literature. So what are some of these arguments, and besides the Grim Reaper paradox? And also, if you guys have any other questions for Rob on anything that we discussed in the previous section, or if you have any other things that you want to talk about, feel free to write them in the live chat. Again, this is a real like intimate time where you guys can just interact back and forth. So, well, yeah, take it.
Yeah.
Like, what's something
Well,
that you've
there've been three really important books the last couple of years. Alex Proust and Josh Rasmussen's
necessary
Necessary
existence?
Being. Yeah, that's right. Alex's book on infinity, causation, and paradox, and then the 24 Arguments Plantinga collection. So, they all have some really interesting arguments, I think. And yeah, so I guess if you want to, we're going to focus on the Kalam related ones. Then I think the causal finitism work that Alex is doing is probably most relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's doing, is, at least the way I think about it, is he's showing that if there's an infinite past, and if there is an infinite number of random events in that past, then you can get paradoxes that would destroy really fundamental principles of rationality, probability, and decision making. And so even the possibility of that, I think, is problematic, right? Because if it turns out that it's epistemically possible even that the world would be like that, then I might be in a situation where, unbeknownst to me, fundamental principles of reason are just breaking down, right? It's a little bit like the hypoxia sort of worry, right? So if you're in a hypoxic situation where you don't get enough oxygen, your reasoning goes
Wait, so, say
crazy.
that again. Hypoxic?
Hypoxia, that's where, yeah, it's like you don't get enough oxygen in the airplane or on the high mountain or something like that.
Okay,
And
you kind of like black out.
your reasoning, well, you think, you're still conscious, but your reasoning goes haywire. And
Mm-hmm.
you start thinking that things are deductively valid when they aren't, right? And you make good arguments when they're just completely crazy. And of course, if you're in that situation, or you think you might be in that situation, it's really tough because you can't argue your way out of it. If I think, oh, I've got a really good argument for the game, not hypoxic, here I can do math problems in my head. Well, but you could easily think you were doing math problems in your head, and you'd be completely unreliable about it.
Mm-hmm.
So the worry here would be
It
that
almost sounds like an evolutionary argument against naturalism type deal.
it's sort of like that. That's right. That's the way I think about it. I put everything into that mold sometimes. So I think
It's like like an
Alex is
evolutionary
doing this, but
debunking
I'm
argument.
sort of saying, yeah, look, if the past were infinite, that threatens to debunk our reasoning. That's right. That's the way I think about it.
So walk me through that one more time because
Yeah.
maybe I just didn't follow. So
Yeah.
what's
So,
the?
well, let me back. Yeah. I mean, I didn't give you any of the argument yet. So,
Okay.
what Alex shows is that if you have an infinite past with an infinite number of, let's say, coin tosses,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, then that's equivalent to what he calls what's called an infinite fair lottery. So an infinite fair lottery is a lottery in which there's an infinite number of possible winning tickets from 1 to infinity, and they're all equally likely. That's the crucial thing, right? Now, it's actually very hard to produce that. In fact, you can't in real life, right? Because,
Yeah, I'm kind of curious how that how he's thinking about that.
yeah. Well, so here, let me give you an example that would show that it is possible for this to happen.
Okay.
Suppose there's been an infinite number of coin tosses. And suppose, this is possible, though very unlikely, that every one of those coin tosses except one came up heads. So there's one tails and all the rest were heads. And the coin tosses, let's say, can be numbered from 1 to infinity, right? Well, the one that came up tails, that corresponds to a specific number, right?
Mm-hmm.
That number will have been picked randomly from all the numbers there are, right? And in such a way that every other number had an equal chance of being picked in this case.
Okay.
So any number could have been the one that came up tails alone, right? And it just
You mean any numbers in terms of like any coin flip could
that's
have
right.
been the one that
Any
came
coin
up to.
flip could have come up. That's right. And so each one corresponds to a different natural number.
Okay.
So there's a symmetry to the situation. right? Now, even if that doesn't happen, even if you just get a random bunch of heads and tails,
Hmm.
uh, there's given set theory and what's called the axiom of choice, there's going to be a function that takes you from such a sequence of an infinitely long sequence of numbers to a specific number as the winner. So we could imagine you've got the Delphic oracle, right? The Oracle of Delphi. And the Oracle of Delphi is mathematically omniscient. And it's sort of worked through found a function that will take us from any infinite sequence of coin tosses to a unique natural number in such a way. Well, let's just say he has that function. Now we do the actual flips, right? We then give the sequence to the oracle. And the oracle says, number n, right? Using its function. Again, you can use symmetry arguments to argue that in that case, every natural number would have an equal chance of being picked, no matter how big. They all get an equal chance of being picked. Okay.
Because we're talking about a fair
It's a fair
coin toss.
That's right. It's an infinite.
So there's chancy, all that.
That's right. And when you have that many chance events, namely an infinite number, you are in effect picking a unique natural number via this
every time
that happens, right? So but that assumption leads to all kinds of crazy results, right? So for instance, suppose we run the lottery twice. So I get my number, you get your number. Okay, I open my envelope, read my number. No matter how big the number is, I'm going to be shocked at how low it is, right? Because no matter how big it is, there's going to be a finite number of numbers that are smaller and an infinite number of numbers that are bigger. So I'm going to look at that number and say, wow, the odds that I would get a number so low is 0. It's practically probably one that it would be much bigger than the number I actually got. So I look at you with your envelope and I think, well, his number must be much, much greater than mine, right? Based on that reasoning I just did. But you'll do the same reasoning, right? You'll look at your number, no matter how big it is, you'll think, wow, it's amazingly low. Rob must have gotten a much bigger number. And so a third party could easily exploit us and say, well, guess what? If you pay me $2, I will let you switch numbers or something, right? And then we would gladly do that, right, if we're going to win a prize with the largest number. And we'd be rationally justified. That's the weird thing, right, in acting really weird and stupidly, because there's a compelling probabilistic argument for thinking that this number I have is incredibly small, right? And the odds that your number will be bigger is got to be 1, right? Because there's an infinite number of bigger numbers, right? So that's crazy, of course. And once you get the idea, you can just generate more and more examples of sort of crazy things that people would have to do. So, for instance, suppose I wanted to convince you of some hypothesis that's extremely unlikely, right? And let's see if I can remember how this goes. Or suppose that I've got. Let's see if I remember how this goes. I need to get Alex in here to remind us how this works. Yeah, so
we have a couple questions in the live chat too.
Right.
So after we get through this, we'll turn to those, and then we can go back to some additional arguments.
Right. Okay, so suppose I flip a coin 100 times.
Okay.
And if I get all heads, right, I will give you a number that's generated in a normal way, right? Where I flip another coin and I keep flipping until I get to heads. The first heads I get that will be
your number.
Yeah, your number, right? So it's going to be probably a pretty small number, right? If I don't get 100 heads the first time, right, I get even one tail, I will then get a number instead from the infinite lottery, right? And I will give you the number, right? Now you will look at that number, and no matter how big that number is, you will think, wow, that's an incredibly small number. That couldn't have come from the infinite lottery. Therefore, it must have come from the other procedure, and Rob must have gotten 100 heads in a row, which is crazy. Right? Shouldn't think that, right? Obviously. But there's a very strong probabilistic argument here, I think a compelling one, for doing that if you assume there really is this infinite fair lottery. So basically, all probabilistic reasoning and all decision making goes haywire in this context, and so that I think provides us. Well,
This
I
is
think
yeah.
we must know a priori that infinite fair lotteries are impossible, and that means we must know a priori that an infinite past is impossible. I think that follows.
What? Yeah. What's the connection there? Yeah.
Well, because if
And this
there's
is
a
this is going back to like the generalization problem,
that's
the previous one.
well, right, and here, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if I could remember all the technical details of the set theory argument that he makes. But the argument is that if there were an infinite number of past events, each of which was
Mm-hmm.
a coin toss, and all the results are somehow available to us, so you're violating causal finitism there because you've got an infinite number of causes from all these coin tosses, then that is equivalent to an infinite fair lottery. That basically does pick out a unique natural number. Again, if I have access to a Delphic oracle or some kind of a mathematical function, or there's one chapter here where he actually describes how you would build a machine that would do this. It's a kind of multi-dimensional machine that actually carries this out. So it wouldn't be a practical task, but his point is that it's mathematically possible to build a machine.
So in this scenario, are we arriving at a contradiction again,
It's not
or are
quite
we
the
or
same. Yeah, no, it's not a contradiction. So it's unless you assume that that
that we
these
can reason normal like
that's right that are
we can yeah.
that these fundamental principles of probabilistic reasoning are valid, are sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
In all possible situations, or at least in all situations. I mean, the way I would put it, can we be sure that those principles are valid, right? Priori, or something like that. And if so, then we must be able to rule out the infinite pair lotteries, and that means we must also be able to rule out the infinite past. So the idea is that if you want to claim that human reason is secure, you can only do it by ruling out the infinite past. So as you said, there is kind of a parallel here with the evolutionary argument. In a way, this infinite past represents the same kind of threat that a unguided evolutionary process might pose to our rationality. But it's a bit more. I think it's a bit more rigorous actually than the evolutionary argument.
Oh yeah.
Because you
Yeah,
don't
for
have
sure.
to say, oh well, how could evolution do this? I mean, you can actually say, look, here's where the reasoning would actually break down in this context.
Right. So it'd be like an infinite past debunking argument.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that's the way I would do it. I don't think that Alex actually does it. So in the book, he just sort of leaves it that, wow, this would be really weird. These are bizarre paradoxes. But I think it could.
That seems like an Alex thing to do.
Yeah, that's right. I think it could be turned into a kind of epistemological argument for God's existence or for the finite past. Actually.
All right. So this one is from John Michael Salinas. He says, for Aristotelians, numbers are tropes with causal powers. Is there an objection internally to Aristotelians where mathematical structures exist timelessly with causal powers?
Okay, let's see. So this is hard stuff.
Yeah, I can read that one again if you'd like me to.
The best Aristotelian theory of mathematics is a tough problem. But let's see. I mean, I'm inclined to think that the best thing to do here is to appeal to God's mind, right? That is that even if he creates only a finite number of things, he could have created an infinite number, or he's aware of all the infinite kinds of things he could have created. And so within his own mind, there are these very rich mathematical structures. And, and the mathematical things that God is aware of have had real causal influence on the world he made. So, that's why I think the world we see around us is mathematically consistent and mathematically describable, because it's an expression of a God who understood all these things from the beginning. I hope
Fair enough.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, John, if you're still here and you have any other questions, then just leave it in the live chat and we can take the conversation from there. Oh, yes. This one is from Aiden Peterson. He says, "Hey, Dr. Coons, you hinted at it earlier, I think, but do you think that the Kalam works on the B theory? If so, would it be the same normal formulation?"
Yeah, I mean, I said that the particular argument that we were talking about, the Grim Reaper, as far as I can tell, doesn't depend on the A theory at all. And I don't think that most of the Kalam arguments do either. I'm not aware of any that I think really depend on the A theory. I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe
So
Craig
here's
would
so
disagree.
Craig's normal formulation is everything that begins to exist has a cause. And so there's another guy,
Yeah. Well, why
Jacobus
couldn't B theorists
Erasmus.
accept that? That seems fine.
So have you do you know who Jacobus Erasmus is?
The famous Erasmus of the Renaissance and all that.
No, no, no,
No, no, not
no.
Desiderius. No, that was
He's a
Desiderius
guy.
Erasmus. No, I guess I don't.
I think he's from South Africa actually.
Okay.
But he has a book out on the Kalam cosmological argument where he gives a sort of reassessment of it, and he thinks maybe I don't know if he I can't remember exactly if he thinks that it does depend on it, but he is a philosopher and he thinks that it is kind of connected, and so he sort of just assumes A theory. But you don't think? I mean, in most okay, I'll say this too, and this is for everybody watching. Most philosophers that when I ask this question to, most of them say no. There's no like direct necessity to have an A theory of time for the Kalam,
Yeah.
even on the original version that Craig uses.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit. So why do you think that it doesn't depend on A theory?
Yeah. Well, let's see. So,
Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause.
yeah, right. So, I mean, I don't see why all that isn't completely consistent with the B theory. So, I mean, the universe began at a particular moment in time. Um, yes, right. I mean, there's nothing there that says that that moment had to be or is now in the past or something like that. So, we don't have to attribute to it some metaphysically privileged notion of pastness. All we need to know is that here's an event that occurs at a particular point in time. Events that begin at a particular point of time have to have a cause at that time. I mean, I mean, it seems B theorists could believe that as well, right? I mean, so suppose we think of the time as being spread out in this big block, right? This is the caricature, at least of the B theory. And let's go with it for the moment. So here we are in the present. There are all these future events out there. Why can't there be causal relations among the parts of that block? Why can't some of the parts be responsible for causing later parts? I mean, why can't there be an ontological dependency relation of later parts on earlier parts? Well, that seems to me perfectly consistent with saying that, at least from God's point of view, all these moments of time are equally real. But they stand in these causal dependency relationships to each other. All that seems to me fine. And some
Yeah,
people,
so I think a lot of people get hung up on this language of began to exist, begins to exist, because Craig does say that he's sort of denoting like a coming into existence, which does kind of carry the tensed baggage, so to speak.
I guess so. But I mean, if I bake a cake, right? The cake comes into existence this afternoon. It had to have a cause in order to do that. I mean, I don't see how any of that implies an A theory. It's just describing a particular event in time. Right? I mean, some A theorists, maybe Craig is like this, think that if you're a B theorist, you don't really believe in time at all, right? And if you don't really believe in time, then it is difficult to make sense of causation, I think. But B theorists would push back and say, no, we believe in time, right? We can certainly accept this principle that if something begins to exist at a certain point in time, it must have a cause.
Yeah, event A and event B are going to have an earlier than or later than relationship.
That's right. That's right.
And so that would still like be a kind of time thing.
That's right.
You'd have a time property, temporal property.
I mean, let's look at it this way. I can look back in the past now, right? And I can say something like slavery was a cause of the Civil War, right? That seems to be true, right? Now, that's a relationship between two events that both of which exist now in the past, right? And they have for all time, I think, this causal relationship between them, that one was cause of the other. Civil War didn't cause slavery, right? Slavery caused the Civil War. That's true about past events, right? So we don't need to bring in the movement of the present or anything like that to make sense of causation, as far as I can tell. I mean, when I attracted to A theory, it has nothing to do with this sort of stuff. It's that the thing that's hard to believe about the B theory, I think, is that it's hard to make sense of our own actual experience of time moving, so to speak, right? Because on the B theory, in a sense, my future
Yeah.
states are already there. And so, in what sense am I sort of moving towards them? That's the thing that gives me pause. That plus, I think, well, I guess that's the main thing. But on the other hand, for a Christian, the difficulty of the A theory, I think, is omniscience. How do you explain how God knows things about all times, whether past, present, or future, if there is no future for him to know? It's
So we're gonna jump into the previous question that I asked you earlier about Aristotelians and causal powers and all that.
yeah.
So he has it clarifying. He says, I was thinking of a Max Tegmark level 4 universe where the universe is just one mathematical structure of an infinite number of structures. If math structures have causal powers, would this present a problem for what the first cause is?
Okay, right. Um, yeah, so I don't know. To be honest, I have a hard time taking the Tegmark kind of thing real seriously. So, I mean, Tegmark's view is that, you and I are just sort of mathematical structures in some really big mathematical structure. And I think that implies that we're not only that time is something like an illusion, but it really implies that we're all necessary beings, right? I mean, I'm as necessary as a number three anyway. We're all just
Wow.
various mathematical structures. So that, I think, is going to be
Hmm.
inconsistent with causation, right? Because I don't think one thing can't cause another thing if they're both absolutely necessary beings. And I think that's what you get from the Tegmark kind of picture. So we need to have contingency in the world somewhere. And I don't see how you get
Interesting.
contingency in a purely mathematical world.
Okay, so there you go, John. So if you have any more questions or objections, then write it down. I think we have another one. Um, said sorry I had to re-log in. This one's from Ale. What's up, man? He says there are no infinite causal chains. Why not take it that all events are caused except for the first events are uncaused?
Well, that's the idea. That's right. So if all the causal chains are finite in the past, then they all lead back to some uncaused first cause. And of course, I haven't proved that there's only one uncaused first cause. That's the stage two, right? Or it's part of
Yeah,
stage two.
maybe that's not a question actually for
Hmm.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he might have actually been responding to someone else. Okay, so another one, Esteban Bonilla. Evening, Dr. Coons. Wouldn't eternalism undermine the finitistic, yeah, I think that's the way you pronounce that, finitistic
Yeah.
project, since eternalism doesn't permit for a potential infinite into the future? Proust points this out in his book on infinity.
Okay. Let me see. So if we're eternalists, then and that's to be an internalist, you're either a B4 or you're a peculiar sort of atheist who thinks that the past, present, and future all exist, but that there's some kind of special quality or something of presentness that's moving through
Mm-hmm.
time. And so in both cases, all the future events are already sort of out there in the future. So the crucial thing about Proust's causal finitism is that it's a backward finitism. That is, each event has a finite number of causes. It doesn't say that each event has a finite number of effects. So it's quite possible that an event could have an infinite number of effects into the future. There's nothing in the argument that rules that out. And again, you can see that with the Grim Reaper. That if you run the Grim Reaper the other way around, and you have Grim Reaper 1 at 1 AD, 2 at 2 AD, 3 and 3 AD, there's no problem, right? Grim Reaper run 1 writes number 1, everybody gets the number 1, and that just gets passed on down through eternity. So there's no contradiction. So there's something peculiar about infinity in the past versus infinity into the future.
Hmm. I'll have to think more on that. Yeah, and Proust does point that out in the rearrangement section of his book
Yeah,
on Grim Reapers.
yeah. I
Something
mean,
along
he's
those lines.
he's I mean, he's a very committed B theorist, so he does believe that there is, in some sense, an actual infinity of things going into the future. I'm not so sure. Like I say, I go back and forth on this, but um, in that respect, maybe that would be hard to square with a strict Aristotelian view. Um, I'm not sure, but in any case, it's consistent with these arguments, I think, because the arguments are only showing that you can't have an infinite sequence or an infinite regress into the past.
So, guys, if you have more questions or objections or whatever, then make sure to write them down in the live chat. And do you have any other arguments? I mean, we don't have to stick to the Kalam. We can move on to something else that's really popular right now, or something super interesting that you're working on. Ontological, contingency, whatever.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of things we've been talking about. We just got finished with the Gödel ontological argument, and yeah, I've become more impressed with that the more I've worked on it. So the ontological
Walk
argument.
me through that one.
Well, so I mean, the ontological argument uses a particular kind of modal logic called S5, which means that whatever is necessarily necessary, whatever possible is necessarily possible. So the modal characteristics of propositions are themselves necessary, true in all worlds. So if you have a possibly existing necessary being, so a being that exists necessarily in some possible world, then it has to exist necessarily in every world. Right? Because from the point of view of that world, it's a necessary being, and therefore it must be true in all worlds. And whatever modal status it has in one world has to have in all worlds. Right? So if you can define God in such a way that his essence includes necessary existence, then, and at least in the content, then, and you can assume that God is possible, then you get that he's actual and even necessary. Right? So that's the kind of amplifying power of the S5 logic here. So what Gödel does, Kurt Gödel, great mathematician, German mathematician in the 20th century, early 20th century, what he did was he went back to the argument that Leibniz gives for the ontological argument, where Leibniz wasn't satisfied with just asserting that it's possible that God exists. He wanted to prove that it was possible that God exists. And he did that by saying that we could define God as the being that has all of the purely positive characteristics. So a God is a being with nothing negative, nothing privative, nothing sort of limiting to him, but just purely positive properties. And then Leibniz argues that if you have only positive properties, you must be possible, because impossibility always results from some kind of clash between a positive and a negative property, between a presence and an absence of some kind. So it's impossible to be a round square, because the square requires the presence of four corners and the circle demands the absence of any corners. So that produces the impossibility. But if you have only purely positive properties that don't imply any kind of absence or negation, then it's always possible. You can always combine them. And so then the only thing that he needs is to claim that necessary existence is a positive property. But it's plausibly it is, because it just means existing in every possible situation. So what's more positive than that, right? There's nothing negative or limiting about that. And so you put all that together, and you get that God necessarily exists, right? So that's pretty cool. And what Gödel does is he just takes that Leibnizian argument and he formalizes it in a really precise, sharp way that is like almost undeniable, I think.
So it's almost undeniable. How do you? Seems to me that like we'd have to define the terms. So like, what do we mean by positive and negative and
right? Yeah, no, that's right. I mean that's where it gets tricky. And in Leibniz's own case, in both Leibniz and Gödel's case, you get the result that all of God's properties are properties he has necessarily. So you end up with no contingency in God whatsoever. And I'm actually happy with that. That's the traditional Thomistic picture of God. But a lot of other Christian theologians and philosophers have tried to modify the arguments so that you don't get that result, including Proust has come up with some versions where you don't get that result.
Oh, interesting. So, yeah, I think Craig is like he's committed to God having contingent properties.
Yeah,
but also even Ed Feser has admitted that you can have these sort of Cambridge type contingent properties.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm fine with that too. But so the question here is how to understand Gödel's argument when he talks about properties of God. Does he include the Cambridge properties or not? And it's pretty clear he doesn't. He doesn't mean to. And Leibniz.
Yeah, and Cambridge property means a property that someone has in virtue of something else, right? Not in virtue of like what it has in its own nature,
That's
so
right.
to speak.
Yeah.
So like this cup, I have the property sitting next to this cup, but not because something that's intrinsic to me. It's just because this cup is sitting here that I have this sort of Cambridge relation.
That's right. Yeah, you have the property of existing in a world in which the cup exists, or something like that. That would be a classic example of a Cambridge property. Yeah, that's right. It was originally coined, I think, by Peter Geach, something like that at Cambridge, anyway, back in the 30s, and they were talking about change. So, for instance, when Socrates dies, his wife becomes a widow, and that's a Cambridge change in Xantippe. She doesn't really intrinsically change; she just Socrates is the one that changes, right, from being dead to dead.
Yeah, an external type of change. Yeah,
extrinsic kind of change. That's right.
So, so going back to positive and negative, what is the definition here of positive? Like, what is a positive property?
Yeah, so there's two ways to think about it. One way to think about it would be a property whose possession does not entail any negation, privation, or absence or limitation, anything kind of negative or limiting in any way. The other way.
Well, so here's another thing. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump on that because, so if any positive property, so take the property of necessary existence. Any being that is necessary is going to have the property being, is going to have the essential property being necessary.
Yeah.
That's right. But if that's a necessary truth, then any necessary truth is going to entail anything. So that necessary truth would entail all the positives and all the negatives.
Well, no, actually, necessary truths don't entail anything except other necessary truths. So for one thing, to entail another means that in any world in which the first one is true, the other one is true as well. So since a necessary truth is already true in every possible world, it will only entail other things that are true in all possible worlds. So you don't get entailment. You never get entailment from a necessary truth to a contingent truth, let's say.
Okay.
So that wouldn't be the problem. I mean, you might worry that, look, if I say that God is necessary, I'm saying he's not necessary. And isn't that a kind of limitation? But I think the answer is no, not really. So a double negation like that doesn't count as a negative property. It's just the exclusion of something negative. And then
so a positive property is something that doesn't entail a privation or like a limit, maybe?
Yeah, that's right. Something along those lines. I mean, it's a little fuzzy, admittedly.
Yeah. Well, let's think about a concrete example of like a positive property. So like goodness.
Right. I think that's fine.
Is that something that's talked about? So like a property of being good, or like truthfulness doesn't entail a negative property, like, or a lack of something.
That's right. Yeah. Knowledge is positive. Doesn't entail anything negative. One of which we've been talking about this in the seminar, is the notion of power. And so, for instance, there's this old problem: if God is all powerful, does that mean he's able to do bad things as well, irrational or wicked things, or something like that? And I would like to say no. And so I would like to define. I would say that the kind of power that's truly positive is a kind of capacity to respond well to reasons, something like that. And God has that property, to the nth degree, perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly consistent with also being perfectly good. So, I mean, to some extent, you could argue that we have to kind of figure out what the positive properties are. And the test that Leibniz gives us here is, well, it should be compatible with all the other positive properties, right? Whatever those are. So there's a kind of a bit of back and forth that can be taking place here as we try to refine our notions of it. But the other thing that Leibniz says, and that Gödel does too briefly, is that we think that a positive property is a great making or good making property. And that's, of course, connected with the whole privation theory of evil, that all evil features are lacks of something, absences of something good. And so that's all kind of connected.
So anyway, in these discussions, I really like Josh Rasmussen's praiseworthy test.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that would work as well. And, again, these are just all different ways of helping us hone in on what these divine characteristics are going to look like.
Okay.
So,
So now that I have a better idea of the positive and negative and stuff,
mm-hmm.
walk me again through the argument. How do we get from a thing that has all the positive properties? How do we get from there to it's possible that God exists?
Well, the basic axiom is that if something has only positive properties, then it's possible. So, and that's because impossibility, right, involves a contradiction somehow. A contradiction involves some kind of clash between the presence and absence of something. So if you define
I
something in
see.
such a way that it's got only positive properties, so that it doesn't entail any absence whatsoever, there's no room for a clash between the presence and absence. You just get presence, right? And so, yeah, so that's the crucial move. And then once
So
you get,
it wouldn't be positive if it couldn't exist.
that's right.
It wouldn't be. It wouldn't. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, if something is impossible, then it must incorporate some negativity as well as some positivity. So there's a clash between those two aspects of it. Yeah.
This is another version of the ontological argument that a buddy of mine. Do you know who Ben Arbor is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. He's he and I were talking about this the other day. Is like, well, think about the realm of possibilia. Like, just take that realm, and there's got to be a greatest being among that set. And so that being exists. You have a sort of different version of the ontological argument.
Yeah, but see, you have to then build in the fact that possible being has necessary existence in that possible world. Because otherwise, if it's merely contingently existing in some possible world, that won't help us here. Right? In other words, I want God to exist in the actual world, not just in some merely possible world.
Yeah.
And that's where this modalized version of the argument, which goes back to Anselm too. I think it's in chapter 3 of the Proslogion, where he defines God there not just as the greatest possible being, but the being such that it's not even possible for him not to exist. So he builds in the necessary existence there as God's attribute, I think for the first time. And that's really what Leibniz and Gödel are building on.
So here I have another question. So Ale was asking a question earlier.
Okay.
And the question that he asked earlier, he said, except there are no infinite causal chains, why not take it that all events are caused except for first events are uncaused? And then he says,
I see.
He clarifies here, he says, I was referring to Oppi's move that the causal principle can be all events have a cause, but the first event, and here he tries principles that avoid accepting there is a first cause. He can have a universe going.
Right. Okay, good. So, well, of course, that move by Oppi is not really an objection to this Kalam style argument, because there, I think Oppi is conceding that the universe has a beginning. And he's saying, but that beginning, so he's objecting to the other premise of the Kalam argument, I guess. Maybe I should put it that way. We've been focusing on the question of whether the past is finite or infinite, right? And what they're challenging is the other premise, the one that says that if the past is finite, if the universe began to exist, then it had to have a cause. And he's suggesting, well, maybe not. Maybe as long as you've got a temporally first event, that's the sort of event that doesn't need a cause. Yeah, so that's where I would, again, go sort of epistemological against Oppi. So I would say, okay, fine. How do you know that your present conscious states are not first events? How can we rule that out? So you can't say, well, I remember stuff I did yesterday, because those memories themselves could have popped into existence as first events without any sort of cause whatsoever. And uncaused mnemonic impressions are not memories, right? So it would be question begging for him to rely on those. So I think we have to say that we can somehow rule out a priori the possibility that my conscious states are first events or that are uncaused events, right? So if I can do that, then it must be that I think that all finite events have causes. At least that's the argument I make. So, in other words,
this is kind of melting my brain because I'm thinking about free will and whether or not that's compatible with the story. Because
right.
You know, if our conscious states are caused, then that seems to imply that there's kind of determinism maybe going on. So we've got to be like the initiating cause of our mental
I see.
states.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. I should have been more clear. I had in mind the sensory impressions, let's say, that we have of the world around us, including our memory impressions. So those things, we have to be
Mm.
able to presume that those things have causes in order to know anything about the world around us, right? So I argue that we're implicitly using some kind of principle of causality there and applying that to our impressions in order to derive the conclusion that they must be caused. But then, in order to do that, we have to we have to have a principle that we can apply a priori to my sensory impressions. And I'll be saying, well, here's the principle: anything that isn't a first event has a cause. But how do I know that my sensory impressions aren't first events? I can't rule that out, right, a priori. And so that's a bad proposal for a principle. It's too restrictive. We need a broader, stronger causal principle to get us out of the skeptical worry here.
Hmm. Maybe he would respond by saying, "Well, that's just a possibility, right? And that doesn't normally cause us worry epistemologically. These sorts of possibilities."
Yeah, but if it's a possibility, then we should take it into account epistemologically. Seems to me.
Hmm.
I mean, it's only things that are impossible that we can legitimately push
Ignore.
aside.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps he could argue, well, it's just really unlikely or something that my sensory impressions are first events. But how would
Mm-hmm.
I know that, right? I mean, that, again, I'd have to have some kind of empirical data to rule that out. So there's that sort of worry.
Yeah. Maybe he could just use like the phenomenal conservatism route of just like, well, it seems to me that my thoughts have, or my what's the term you use? My sensory
Sensory impressions
experiences,
or something.
sensory,
Yeah,
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 they have cause. Seems to me that that's the case.
yeah,
And so absent a defeater, I have some justification for thinking that's the case.
yeah. So the question is whether metaphysical possibilities can count as defeaters here, and it seems to me that they can.
Hmm.
So because look, if any first event could occur uncaused, then then the possibility that my impressions are first events would, you know, would raise as a serious possibility that they might be uncaused.
Well, so it's metaphysically possible that I'm a brain in a vat, but that shouldn't count as a defeater for my seeming that I have two hands.
Right. Yeah. Right. Let's see if I can sort that out. Um, but I don't think I have to concede that it's metaphysically possible that I'm a brain in a vat.
Hmm.
I'm not even sure that it's possible there could be a brain in the vat, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, let me think.
So then, well, I mean, that would be consistent if you would just deny that that's a metaphysical possibility.
Yeah.
But then that strikes me as pretty controversial.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. What I think is we can know a priori somehow that we're not brains in the vat. That's going to be the sort of move I'll make. And that implies that our states have causes, right? Because brains in normal kind of situations have states that are caused by their environment in the appropriate sort of ways. So the point then is that we have some sort of a priori knowledge about how we're connected to the world. And that includes some sort of causal principle, includes some knowledge about how our states are caused.
Hmm.
And then we have to sort of tease out what the shape of that causal principle is and how restricted it can be in order to do the kind of work it needs to do to get us out of the skeptical worry. That's the way I would put it.
Okay. All right, let me move on to, we have another question. Esteban Bonilla, again, he says, Dr. Kunz, Should the concept of a positive property, as seen in the Gödelian ontological argument, be understood as a primitive notion, or should there be some metaphysical backdrop, i.e., Platonism?
Well, I think I think it has definitely some sort of metaphysical backdrop. I'm not sure if it necessarily a Platonistic backdrop. Um, I tried to explain it in terms of the absence of negations or absences or limitations or something like that. And so the notion really does depend on our having some kind of grip on that, on a difference between something really being present and something being an absence or a privation of some kind. Now, you might argue that goes back to Plato. I think it probably does, that notion, maybe back to the sophist. But I'm not sure that it requires, let's say, a particular theory about universals to make sense of that. I mean, Leibniz himself, I don't think, was really a Platonist about, well, I mean, he did think that there were properties that were ideas in God's mind. But, let me see. Okay, let me take back what I said. I think in a sense, you're right. You probably can get to some pretty strong kind of Platonism here, at least of a sort. That is, I mean, God is going to have these positive properties. And by having all the positive properties, he really is a kind of paradigm of goodness, power, knowledge, and so on, right? And so you could think of him as this sort of Platonic universal of those things. And you could make a pretty strong case for that.
Fair enough. All right, let's do one more. And this one is actually he's asking you to explain one of your arguments that's supposedly super, super interesting. He's asking about your epistemological argument from the elegance of the laws against scientific knowledge under materialism.
Yeah, so that was a paper I did actually way back in 2000. And it's called The Incompatibility of Scientific Realism and Naturalism. I was really focusing on naturalism there. And what I did was I looked at a lot of writings by working physicists, theoretical physicists, including Steven Weinberg and others, so not non-theists necessarily, who pointed out that the progress of physics really depends upon our coming to appreciate the beauty of the laws of nature. There's a kind of aesthetic sense that we develop as we work with nature that guides us to the right theories, to the right laws of nature. And I said, okay, suppose that's right, and suppose that we think that we have knowledge of the laws of nature as a result of this process. So that's where the scientific realism came in. It was both a metaphysical and an epistemological kind of realism. Then it must be that this sense of beauty that we acquire and the beauty that we're corresponding to is somehow an indicator of truth, an indicator of of law and lawfulness, of the lawfulness of the laws of nature, right? But suppose that the laws of nature are just happen to share this beauty, this characteristic of beauty by chance. There's no underlying cause of the fact that they're all beautiful in this way. Then it wouldn't be knowledge. It would just be dumb luck that enabled us to stumble into the laws of nature as they actually are. The only way that responding to beauty could actually be conferring knowledge is if there's some kind of common ground, some common explanation of the beauty that runs through all the laws of nature. Right? And presumably also, I mean, some explanation of how we're able to respond to that beauty, but I didn't even push that in that particular paper. And so that requires a supernatural power of some kind, because almost by definition, if you can shape the laws of nature in a certain way,
Yeah, exactly.
You are supernatural. And also, probably personal, because if you're shaping them in order to be beautiful, you must have some kind of appreciation of aesthetic value as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a variation of the evolutionary argument against naturalism, but based on instead of evolution,
it doesn't rely on defeaters really. It's more looking at the idea that knowledge involves a kind of non-accidental progress towards the truth, right?
Right.
And so, if the beauty of the laws of nature is what gets us there, then the fact that they're beautiful has to be non-accidental. And that requires an underlying cause.
Well, so couldn't someone just say, well, beauty is subjective?
But then you lose the scientific realism, right? So if beauty is just some subjective
So why is that?
thing,
Why
Well,
would you lose scientific realism?
because in fact, as we pick which theories we're going to believe in science, we do so on the basis of this aesthetic sense that we develop. This is what Weinberg and others sort of document.
Hmm.
And so, if that sense of beauty is just some subjective quirk, then it's not really guiding us to the truth, unless it's doing so just accidentally again, and that doesn't count as knowledge. In order for it to be something that's guiding us in a knowledge-conferring way to the truth, there has to be some non-accidental connection between the beauty of the laws and there being laws.
Mm-hmm. So here's another way of pressing you a little bit further on this is and we're about to close it out. So I really appreciate your time tonight.
Sure.
It's been amazing. So I know that there's different types of luck in the literature on epistemology.
Yeah.
Knowledge.
Right.
So because there's going to be luck involved no matter what's going on. So so the type of luck involved is really important.
Right.
So why do you think that this particular kind of luck is sort of undermining knowledge?
Yeah. So well, if the luck is let's put it this way.
So like even if God had created me with reliable cognitive faculties, it's still kind of like a lucky situation that God chose to do that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Or I mean, I could, I get picked to go to Stanford by some lottery or something, right? And then by virtue of going to Stanford, I get to learn all kinds of stuff, and so I was happy to learn that stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of luck it doesn't affect knowledge. That's right. So you have to look at the actual process by which you're forming the belief, right? The process that is whose proper functioning, right, leads to towards knowledge. And if Weinberg and these other folks are right, this aesthetic dimension is essential to this process, right? That is, we could never have gotten to the laws of nature as we have if we weren't following these aesthetic clues. So it really not just some precursor to our getting scientific knowledge. It's essential to the very process of gaining this kind of theoretical knowledge. And that, I think, has to be non-accidentally connected to the truth if it's going to be knowledge. I mean, it's like if I'm trying to figure out who committed a particular crime, right? And I put together a case based on these physical evidence and so on, right? And it turns out that there's no connection between the physical evidence I accumulated and the person that I end up arresting. But I get the right guy nonetheless, right? Just by chance. It's not knowledge, right? The clues that I find have to be non-accidentally connected to the guilt of the person in order for it to work. Well, the aesthetic qualities are the clues that the scientists are following as they pursue the laws of nature. So if those clues are not connected to the actual truth of the laws of nature, then it's not knowledge.
I'm thinking about that analogy more now. So I can imagine like aliens coming and planting some evidence that's disconnected. That's some additional evidence, even though this is the guy. You've got the guy who committed the murder. But they come and give you some additional pieces of evidence that convicts him.
Right.
And you're saying that you don't know that he's guilty based on that.
Well, it depends. So, yeah, I mean, it might be really lucky in the sense that that these aliens came along if they're providing the evidence that's really connected to the person's guilt, right? Then that's fine, right? And so similarly, maybe we're sort of lucky in that I don't know, we had the opportunities to do science, or we were lucky in that we had people who were capable of this kind of aesthetic appreciation who ended up in physics. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got there. All that kind of luck is fine. That doesn't challenge the validity of the knowledge. But when it's the clues themselves, that is, the things they're taken as indicators of lawfulness, if those things are not connected to real lawfulness, then we don't have knowledge.
All right, let's close it out. It was an awesome time, and thank you guys. Thank all of our patrons for joining us tonight and just being amazing. And it's late. It's time to go to bed.
Absolutely, yeah. Great.
Yeah,
well,
but
so
again, I appreciate you coming on. And like I said, we need to try to plan something. Maybe not anything time soon, but on stage 2, the contingency argument and all that. I think that It'd be really awesome. And maybe what we could do, as I'm thinking about it now, is have like a kind of a 3-way discussion between you, myself, and Josh Rasmussen. That might be really fun.
That'd be great.
So,
yeah, good idea.
Cool.
Great.
All right.
Great.
All right. Well, have a good night, and we'll see you guys later.
Thanks. You too. Yeah. Bye.